The night a room full of powerful people stood and applauded his wife. Nathaniel Whitmore finally realized the person he had been ashamed of was never Simone. It was himself. The flash of cameras painted the Manhattan sidewalk in bursts of white light as black SUVs lined the entrance of the Grand Regent Hotel. The building rose above Fifth Avenue like a monument to money, influence, and carefully managed reputations. Beneath the gold-lit canopy, reporters adjusted microphones, photographers called out names, and guests stepped onto the red carpet wearing designer gowns and tailored tuxedos worth more than some families earned in a month. It was the annual Whitmore Foundation Gala, one of the most anticipated charity events in New York City. Every major business publication was there. Every political donor wanted a seat inside. Every camera was pointed toward the entrance, waiting for one man. Nathaniel Whitmore emerged from the back of a sleek black sedan and immediately drew attention from every direction. At 41, he was the face of Whitmore Capital, one of the fastest-growing investment firms in America. His name appeared regularly on magazine covers. Financial networks followed his predictions. Industry leaders fought for invitations to his events. Tonight was no different. Camera flashes erupted the moment his polished shoes touched the pavement. "Nathaniel, over here," one photographer shouted. "Nathaniel, look this way," called another. He paused at the center of the carpet, offering the practiced smile that had helped build a billion-dollar empire. The smile was confident without appearing arrogant, warm without revealing anything personal. Every movement seemed rehearsed. Every angle seemed calculated. Behind him, the city glowed beneath the cool autumn sky. The air carried the scent of expensive perfume and fresh rain from an earlier shower. For a moment, everything looked perfect. Then a reporter near the front raised her voice. "Mr. Whitmore, where's your wife tonight?" The question hung in the air. A few nearby journalists turned immediately. Several cameras shifted direction. Nathaniel's smile froze for the briefest fraction of a second before returning. Most people never would have noticed. But the cameras captured everything. "Simone prefers to stay out of the spotlight," he said smoothly. A few reporters nodded. The answer sounded reasonable enough. Then he added something else. "She's not really comfortable at events like this." A small laugh drifted through the crowd. Not cruel, not loud, just enough to land. Nathaniel chuckled politely and continued walking toward the entrance. Within seconds, the moment was gone. New questions replaced old ones. More flashes exploded. More guests arrived. The gala moved forward. But nearly 8 miles away, in a quiet brownstone in Brooklyn, Simone Carter heard every word. The television screen illuminated the living room with soft blue light. Nathaniel's face filled the screen. His smile, his polished answer, his effortless dismissal. Simone sat at a wooden dining table covered with folders, grant applications, and handwritten notes from students. The house was silent except for the distant hum of traffic outside and the voice of the news anchor summarizing gala coverage. She stared at the screen for several seconds after Nathaniel disappeared from view. Then she reached for the remote and turned the television off. The room fell quiet again. No tears, no anger, no dramatic reaction, only silence. The kind of silence that comes after disappointment has visited too many times to surprise you anymore. Simone leaned back in her chair and looked at the stack of scholarship applications waiting beside her. A yellow desk lamp cast a warm circle of light across the papers. Outside, rainwater still glistened on the sidewalks beneath the streetlights. She took a slow breath and returned to work. Her fingers moved carefully across a file belonging to a 17-year-old student from Detroit who dreamed of becoming an engineer. The recommendation letters were strong. The grades were exceptional. The family income barely covered necessities. Simone picked up her pen and made a note in the margin. Across the room, framed photographs lined a bookshelf. Children standing beside newly built community libraries. High school graduates holding acceptance letters. Young women smiling in science labs funded through educational grants. Hundreds of stories. Hundreds of lives quietly changed. Yet none of those achievements appeared on magazine covers. None earned her a red carpet invitation. None made headlines. And that had never bothered Simone. What hurt was something else entirely. It wasn't that Nathaniel forgot to mention her accomplishments. It was that he seemed determined to make her invisible. The grandfather clock near the staircase chimed softly. 9 o'clock. Across Manhattan, Crystal glasses clinked beneath chandeliers while executives exchanged business cards and politicians delivered speeches. Nathaniel stood beneath bright lights, surrounded by admiration. Simone sat alone beneath a desk lamp, helping strangers build futures. One life was celebrated publicly. The other existed quietly beyond the cameras. Yet somewhere beneath the noise of the city, beneath the wealth, beneath the carefully polished image Nathaniel spent years protecting, a shift had already begun. Neither of them knew it yet. But before long, the world would learn Simone Carter's name. And when it did, the applause would be impossible to ignore. The following morning arrived wrapped in a pale gray sky that stretched across Brooklyn like a blanket of quiet steel. Simone Carter was already awake before sunrise. The small kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and cinnamon as she reviewed notes spread neatly across the dining table. Outside, delivery trucks rumbled down wet streets, and the city slowly pulled itself into another busy day. Inside the brownstone, the only sound was the steady scratch of her pen. Simone smiled softly. Moments like those mattered more than recognition. They always had. She set the phone down and continued reading applications. Across town, Nathaniel Whitmore stood inside a glass conference room 30 stories above Manhattan. Sunlight reflected off surrounding skyscrapers, turning the walls into mirrors of steel and gold. Executives filled the room. Financial projections glowed across enormous screens. Voices discussed acquisitions, partnerships, and market forecasts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Nathaniel listened with the calm confidence that made investors trust him. Numbers made sense. Markets followed patterns. Success could be measured. Human emotions were far less predictable. As the meeting ended, his assistant handed him a tablet. Several news articles highlighted the previous night's gala. Photos captured him smiling beneath chandeliers. Headlines praised his leadership and philanthropy. He scrolled through them without much interest until one small article caught his attention. It mentioned that his wife had not attended the event. The article was not critical. It simply noted her absence. Yet something about seeing the words in print irritated him. He closed the screen immediately and handed the tablet back. Meanwhile, Simone spent her afternoon visiting a community learning center in Queens. The building itself was modest. Red brick walls, narrow hallways, classrooms filled with donated furniture. Yet every room seemed alive with possibility. Students worked on robotics projects. Teachers prepared lesson plans. Volunteers organized books. When Simone entered, several children greeted her by name. Their excitement carried through the hallways like sunlight breaking through clouds. She knelt beside a young girl building a model bridge from wooden sticks. The girl explained her design with enthusiastic confidence. Simone listened carefully, asking questions and encouraging every idea. There was no camera documenting the moment, no journalist recording her words, no audience beyond the children themselves. Yet those were often the moments she treasured most. As the afternoon faded toward evening, the center's director approached holding a large envelope. "This arrived for you today," he said. Simone accepted it with a polite smile. The envelope was thick and cream-colored, bearing an official seal she did not immediately recognize. She placed it inside her bag without opening it. There would be time later. For now, the students needed her attention. Hours passed. The city lights flickered on one by one. By the time Simone returned home, darkness had settled over Brooklyn. She removed her coat, placed her bag on the table, and finally noticed the envelope again. The room felt unusually quiet. Rain tapped gently against the windows. The old clock near the staircase marked each passing second. Simone sat down beneath the warm glow of the desk lamp and carefully opened the envelope. Several pages slid onto the table. Her eyes moved across the first paragraph, then the second. She blinked and read the words again. For a long moment she simply sat there, motionless. Not because she was shocked, not because she was overwhelmed, because she was trying to understand why someone had chosen her. The letter came from the National Education Foundation. It informed her that after a year-long review process involving educators, community leaders, and independent advisors across the country, she had been selected as this year's recipient of the Foundation's highest humanitarian award. The ceremony would take place in New York City in less than 6 weeks. Leaders from education, business, government, and nonprofit organizations would attend. Simone lowered the letter slowly. The rain continued tapping against the glass. Her reflection stared back from the dark window. Somewhere across the city, Nathaniel was likely attending another dinner, another meeting, another gathering filled with influential people. He had no idea that a letter had just arrived. No idea that doors were beginning to open. No idea that a story he had spent years overlooking was quietly moving toward a stage large enough for the entire country to see. Simone folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. Then she returned to the scholarship applications waiting beside her. The award could wait until tomorrow. The students could not. The following weeks passed with the steady rhythm that had always defined Simone Carter's life. She did not announce the award. She did not post about it online. She did not call reporters or update her biography. The cream-colored envelope remained tucked neatly inside a desk drawer beneath stacks of student records and scholarship reports. Every morning she woke before sunrise, reviewed funding requests, answered emails, and traveled wherever her programs were needed. To Simone, recognition had never been the purpose of the work. The work itself was the purpose. Yet while she remained focused on the people she served, someone else had begun noticing her name. Across Manhattan, inside a bright newsroom overlooking Times Square, investigative journalist Claire Bennett sat surrounded by research notes and open browser tabs. Claire had spent nearly a decade covering philanthropy, education, and social impact initiatives. Most awards followed familiar patterns. Famous names, powerful donors, high-profile foundations. But when the National Education Foundation released a brief announcement listing its upcoming honorees, one name immediately caught her attention. Dr. Simone Carter. Claire frowned slightly. She knew the name, but not from headlines. That alone made her curious. She began searching through public records, nonprofit reports, and archived interviews. What she discovered surprised her. Over the past 12 years, Simone had helped launch literacy programs in more than 30 communities. She had established scholarship funds serving hundreds of students. She had partnered with local organizations to renovate libraries, expand tutoring networks, and support underserved schools. Yet there were almost no media appearances, no aggressive publicity campaigns, no personal branding strategy. It was as if someone had spent over a decade changing lives while deliberately avoiding attention. Claire leaned back in her chair and stared through the newsroom windows. Outside, giant digital billboards flashed advertisements across the city. Attention was one of the most valuable currencies in America. Yet somehow Simone Carter had built an extraordinary legacy without chasing any of it. That alone felt like a story worth telling. Meanwhile, Nathaniel's calendar remained packed from dawn until late evening. Meetings filled every hour. Investors demanded updates. Business magazines requested interviews. One Thursday afternoon, he attended a private luncheon with executives and board members at an exclusive Midtown club. Crystal glasses reflected sunlight from towering windows. Conversations drifted between economic forecasts and expansion plans. During dessert, one board member mentioned a list of upcoming national award recipients. The discussion lasted less than a minute. Nathaniel barely listened until he heard a familiar name. Simone Carter is receiving some education award this year, one executive said casually. Apparently, it is a fairly prestigious one. Nathaniel looked up from his coffee. Simone. The executive nodded. I was surprised too. The foundation keeps a strict selection process. Must be a significant achievement. Nathaniel offered a polite smile. She has always been passionate about education. The conversation quickly moved on. Market trends replaced personal topics. Yet Nathaniel found himself thinking about the comment long after lunch ended. Passionate about education. The phrase sounded strangely incomplete. He realized he could not remember the last time he had asked Simone about her projects in detail. He knew she worked with students. He knew she traveled frequently. He knew people respected her. Beyond that, his understanding felt vague. The realization unsettled him more than he expected. That evening he returned to their Manhattan penthouse later than usual. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a skyline glowing beneath thousands of lights. The apartment was elegant, quiet, and nearly empty. Simone was still in Brooklyn attending a community meeting. Nathaniel loosened his tie and walked through the living room. On a side table sat several framed photographs. Normally, he passed them without much thought. Tonight he stopped. One image showed Simone standing beside a group of high school graduates holding scholarship certificates. Another showed children gathered around newly installed computers inside a learning center. Every face in the photographs seemed illuminated by genuine happiness. Nathaniel studied the pictures longer than he intended. There was something striking about them. Not prestige, not status, purpose. The kind of purpose that could not be measured in stock prices or quarterly earnings. Across the East River, Simone finished speaking at a neighborhood education forum. Parents, teachers, and volunteers lingered afterward to thank her. One mother introduced her teenage son, who had recently earned admission into college through one of Simone's scholarship programs. The young man's eyes shone with excitement as he described his plans to study engineering. Simone listened with a warm smile. Moments later, she stepped outside into the cool evening air. The city lights stretched across the horizon like scattered stars. She had no idea a journalist was investigating her work. No idea articles were beginning to take shape. No idea that conversations about her achievements were quietly spreading through rooms she had never entered. The spotlight she had avoided for years was moving toward her anyway, one careful step at a time. 3 days later, Claire Bennett sat alone in a quiet corner office long after most of the newsroom had gone home. The city shimmered beyond the glass walls, a sea of white and amber lights stretching toward the horizon. A half-finished cup of coffee sat beside her keyboard as she reviewed another stack of documents connected to Simone Carter's work. The deeper she looked, the more extraordinary the story became. There were no scandals, no hidden financial arrangements, no carefully manufactured publicity campaigns. Instead, there were thousands of pages filled with measurable impact. Scholarship records, community partnerships, educational grants, letters from teachers, letters from parents, letters from students whose lives had changed because one woman refused to stop believing in them. Claire rubbed her eyes and opened another file. This one contained testimonials collected over several years. A young woman from Texas described becoming the first person in her family to attend college. A teacher from Ohio explained how a literacy initiative had transformed reading scores across an entire district. A former scholarship recipient now working as a physician credited Simone's support for changing the direction of his life. Claire stared at the screen in silence. Most public figures spent enormous amounts of money trying to build a legacy. Simone Carter had somehow built one while avoiding attention altogether. The realization stayed with her throughout the night. The next morning, Claire requested an interview. The email arrived in Simone's inbox shortly after sunrise. She read it while reviewing budget reports for a new after-school program. The request was respectful and detailed. Claire explained that she was preparing a feature article highlighting influential leaders in education and community development. She wanted to tell Simone's story. Simone sat quietly for several moments before setting the phone aside. Outside the window, early morning sunlight spilled across Brooklyn rooftops. The city was waking up. Car horns echoed in the distance. A delivery truck rolled past the brownstone. She knew publicity could help attract resources for the students she served. She also knew attention often changed the focus from the mission to the individual. For years, she had chosen the mission. Yet the awards ceremony was approaching, and perhaps the story no longer belonged entirely to her. Perhaps it belonged to the people whose lives had been touched along the way. Later that afternoon, she agreed to meet Claire. Across Manhattan, Nathaniel stepped into another media interview. Studio lights illuminated the set while cameras tracked his movements from multiple angles. The host praised his leadership, his business success, and his charitable contributions. Nathaniel answered each question with practiced confidence. He understood this environment. Every statement carried a purpose. Every appearance strengthened a carefully managed image. Near the end of the interview, the host smiled and glanced toward her notes. Before we wrap up, I wanted to ask about your wife. I have been hearing her name more frequently lately. Dr. Simone Carter. She seems to be doing remarkable work in education. Nathaniel blinked once. It was subtle, almost invisible. Yet for the first time during the interview, he hesitated. Yes, he replied. She has dedicated a great deal of her life to helping students. The host nodded. Several organizations have described her impact as transformational. Nathaniel offered a polite smile. The conversation moved on, but the moment lingered in his thoughts long after the cameras stopped rolling. That evening, he arrived home earlier than usual. The penthouse felt unusually calm. Soft music drifted from the living room. Through the open doorway, he saw Simone sitting near the windows overlooking the city. Papers covered the coffee table. The fading sunlight painted the room in shades of gold and amber. For a moment, he simply watched her. She looked exactly as she always did. Focused, calm, comfortable in a world that demanded nothing from appearances. "Long day?" he asked. Simone looked up and smiled gently. "Productive day." Nathaniel loosened his tie and sat across from her. His eyes drifted toward the folders spread across the table. Normally, he would have walked past without a second glance. Tonight, he found himself curious. "What are you working on?" Simone paused briefly. The question surprised her more than she expected. "Scholarship reviews," she answered. "We are selecting students for next year's leadership program." Nathaniel nodded. The silence that followed felt unfamiliar. Not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. Outside the windows, thousands of lights sparkled across the city. Inside, something subtle had begun to shift. Neither of them spoke about the award. Neither mentioned the growing attention surrounding her work. Yet for the first time in a very long time, Nathaniel found himself wondering how much of Simone's world existed beyond the version he thought he knew. And somewhere else in the city, Claire Bennett began writing the first draft of an article that would soon introduce Simone Carter to millions of readers across America. The article was published on a Monday morning. By noon, it had spread far beyond the education circles where Claire Bennett originally expected it to land. The headline appeared on major news websites, nonprofit newsletters, university forums, and social media feeds across the country. Readers who had never heard Simone Carter's name suddenly found themselves captivated by a story that felt increasingly rare. It was not a story about celebrity. It was not a story about wealth. It was a story about service. Claire had written carefully, focusing not on awards but on impact. She described the students who became engineers, teachers, physicians, and entrepreneurs because someone believed in them before anyone else did. She described libraries rebuilt in neglected neighborhoods. She described scholarship programs that opened doors for young people who had spent years hearing those doors were closed. Most importantly, she described the woman behind it all. By mid-afternoon, Simone's inbox was overflowing. Messages arrived from educators in California, parents in Georgia, nonprofit leaders in Illinois, and former scholarship recipients now scattered across the country. Some simply wanted to congratulate her. Others shared stories of how her programs had affected their lives. Simone read several messages before setting her laptop aside. The attention felt overwhelming. Not unpleasant, just unfamiliar. Outside her Brooklyn office window, children were arriving for an after-school tutoring session. Their laughter drifted through the hallway. The sound grounded her immediately. She stood, straightened a stack of folders, and returned to work. Meanwhile, inside Whitmore Capital's headquarters, the article was generating a different kind of conversation. Nathaniel stepped out of an executive meeting and noticed several employees gathered near a reception area television. The screen displayed a segment discussing influential leaders in education. Simone's photograph appeared beside images of students and community centers. Nathaniel slowed his pace. He rarely saw his wife featured on national broadcasts. The anchor described her work as one of the most significant grassroots educational efforts in recent years. Another guest praised her commitment to underserved communities. Nathaniel listened for several moments before continuing down the hallway. Something about hearing strangers discuss Simone with such admiration felt strangely disorienting. Not because he doubted her abilities, because he realized how many details he had never bothered to learn. Later that week, invitations began arriving from organizations requesting interviews, speaking engagements, and partnerships. Universities wanted her participation in leadership conferences. Foundations wanted to collaborate. Community groups wanted advice. Simone declined many requests. There simply were not enough hours in the day. Yet the growing attention became impossible to ignore. One Friday evening, she attended a small fundraising dinner for educators. The event was held in a renovated historic building overlooking the East River. Warm lights reflected against exposed brick walls. Teachers, principals, and nonprofit leaders filled the room. Nothing about the gathering felt extravagant. The focus remained entirely on ideas, solutions, and opportunities. As Simone spoke with guests, she noticed several people approaching her for the first time. They thanked her for programs she had created years earlier. They shared stories of students whose futures had changed because resources finally reached their communities. The gratitude felt sincere, quiet, powerful. Across the city, Nathaniel attended a private investor reception at an upscale midtown hotel. Crystal chandeliers hung from soaring ceilings. A string quartet performed near the entrance. Conversations revolved around capital markets, mergers, and economic forecasts. During the evening, a prominent investor approached Nathaniel carrying a glass of sparkling water. "I read that article about your wife," the man said. "Remarkable woman." Nathaniel smiled politely. "She does important work." The investor nodded. "You know, I have spent 20 years funding charitable initiatives. Very few people create measurable results at that scale. She is becoming one of the most respected voices in education." Nathaniel thanked him and moved on to another conversation, but the word stayed with him. Becoming one of the most respected voices in education. The phrase echoed in his mind during the drive home. Rain streaked softly across the car windows as Manhattan's lights blurred into ribbons of gold and white. For years he had assumed he understood success better than anyone. Success had always looked like growth charts, acquisitions, magazine covers, and rising valuations. Yet everywhere he turned lately, people seemed impressed by something entirely different. They were impressed by Simone. Not because of status, not because of wealth, because of the lives she had changed. When Nathaniel entered the penthouse later that night, he found Simone standing near the windows overlooking the city. The skyline shimmered beneath the darkness. For a moment neither spoke. Then Nathaniel glanced toward her and asked a question that surprised even him. "How many students have gone through your scholarship programs?" Simone looked thoughtful. She considered the number for a moment. "Just over 3,000 so far," she answered quietly. Nathaniel stared at her. 3,000. The number settled heavily into the silence between them. Outside, the city continued moving beneath a sea of lights. Inside, for the first time, Nathaniel began to grasp the true scale of a legacy that had been growing right in front of him all along. The following week brought a level of attention that neither Simone nor Nathaniel could completely ignore. What began as a single article had evolved into a national conversation. Educational organizations shared her story. Universities referenced her programs during conferences. Community leaders quoted her work in speeches. Yet despite the growing recognition, Simone's daily routine remained remarkably unchanged. On a cool Tuesday morning, she arrived at a learning center in Newark before most of the staff. The hallways were still quiet. Sunlight streamed through tall windows and stretched across polished floors. She carried a notebook beneath one arm and a cup of coffee in the other. As she walked through the building, she noticed new posters hanging near the entrance. Several students had printed copies of newspaper articles featuring her achievements. One poster displayed a photograph from years earlier, showing Simone standing beside a group of scholarship recipients. Another featured quotes from former students whose lives had been transformed through educational opportunities. Simone paused briefly before continuing down the hallway. She appreciated the gesture, but her focus remained on the students themselves. In a classroom near the back of the building, a group of teenagers were preparing presentations for a leadership workshop. They immediately gathered around her when she entered. One young woman asked for advice about applying to college. Another wanted guidance on public speaking. A young man shared news that he had earned acceptance into an engineering program. Simone listened to each story carefully. Her attention never drifted. Every conversation mattered. Every dream deserved respect. Hundreds of miles away, inside a conference center in Chicago, Nathaniel stood before an audience of investors and business executives. Massive screens displayed market forecasts behind him. The room was filled with influence, wealth, and ambition. Normally, these events energized him. Today, his concentration felt divided. During a networking session between presentations, several attendees approached him. To his surprise, many wanted to discuss Simone rather than business. One executive spoke about a scholarship recipient who now worked for his company. Another praised a literacy initiative that had improved educational outcomes in her community. A third person described Simone as one of the most authentic leaders in America. Nathaniel smiled politely through each conversation, but internally, he found himself wrestling with unfamiliar emotions. Pride, confusion, regret. For years, he had measured success through visibility and influence. Yet the admiration surrounding Simone had been earned without either. Late that evening, he returned to New York and stepped into the penthouse overlooking the city. Rain drifted softly against the windows. The skyline shimmered beneath low clouds. Simone sat at the dining table reviewing grant proposals. The warm glow of a lamp illuminated stacks of paperwork spread neatly around her. Nathaniel loosened his tie and stood quietly for a moment before speaking. "Do you ever get tired?" he asked. Simone looked up. "Of what?" "Helping everyone." A small smile touched her face. "Sometimes." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "Then why keep doing it?" Simone closed the folder in front of her and considered the question carefully. Outside, distant lights reflected against the glass. The room felt unusually still. "Because someone helped me when nobody had to," she said softly. "And because every opportunity changes more than one life." Nathaniel remained silent. Her answer was simple, yet it carried a weight that lingered long after the conversation ended. Later that night, after Simone had gone to bed, Nathaniel wandered through the apartment, unable to sleep. He stopped beside a bookshelf he had passed thousands of times without noticing. Awards, plaques, and framed photographs filled several shelves. He began examining them one by one. Community leadership honors, educational achievement awards, recognition from universities, letters of appreciation. Most were years old, dust-free and carefully maintained, yet somehow invisible to him until now. Then he found a framed photograph tucked near the back. It showed a much younger Simone standing beside a group of children outside a newly opened library. Her smile was genuine, unfiltered, joyful. The children around her looked equally proud. Nathaniel stared at the image for a long moment. He could not remember ever asking about that library. He could not remember asking about many things. A feeling settled heavily in his chest. Not guilt exactly. Something deeper. The realization that while he had spent years building a public image, Simone had spent those same years building people. And now, as the nation slowly discovered what she had accomplished, Nathaniel found himself confronting a truth he could no longer avoid. The woman he thought existed quietly in the background had been creating a legacy powerful enough to command the attention of an entire country. 2 weeks before the award ceremony, the pace of attention surrounding Simone accelerated again. What had started as admiration was becoming something larger. Major newspapers published follow-up stories. National education organizations highlighted her programs during conferences. Former students began sharing their experiences online, creating a wave of personal stories that spread across the country. One evening, while Simone reviewed reports in her Brooklyn office, her phone continued vibrating with notifications. She ignored most of them. Deadlines still needed to be met. Students still needed resources. Budgets still required approval. Recognition did not reduce responsibility. As she worked, a volunteer entered carrying a cardboard box filled with letters. "More arrived today," he said with a smile. Simone looked at the stack. Handwritten envelopes from dozens of states filled the box. Some came from parents. Others came from teachers. Many came from students. After the volunteer left, she opened one at random. A college sophomore from Arizona thanked her for a scholarship that had allowed him to stay enrolled during a difficult financial period. Another letter came from a teacher whose school received technology grants years earlier. Another came from a young woman who had recently become the first attorney in her family. Simone read quietly as the evening sunlight faded beyond the windows. Each letter represented a life moving forward. Each story reminded her why she had started this work in the first place. Across Manhattan, Nathaniel sat alone inside his office long after most employees had gone home. The city glowed beneath the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him. Financial reports covered his desk, but he found himself distracted. Earlier that day, a national magazine had published a feature titled America's Quiet Builders of Opportunity. Simone's photograph occupied an entire page. Nathaniel had read the article twice. Not because he questioned its accuracy, because every paragraph revealed something he never knew. He learned about schools she helped rebuild after funding shortages. He learned about mentorship programs operating in multiple states. He learned that several recipients of her scholarships now held leadership positions in medicine, engineering, education, and public service. The numbers alone were astonishing. Yet what affected him most were the photographs. In every image, Simone stood slightly behind others. Students occupied the center. Families occupied the center. Communities occupied the center. She never appeared interested in being the focus. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair and stared across the dark office. A difficult truth had begun forming inside him. For years, he had introduced people to his accomplishments. Simone had introduced people to possibilities. The difference suddenly felt enormous. A few days later, Claire Bennett released a second article. This one focused entirely on former students. The response was immediate. Television producers requested interviews. Podcasts invited Simone to appear as a guest. Educational foundations announced new partnerships. Donations to several scholarship funds increased dramatically. Everywhere people looked, they found evidence of her impact. Yet Simone continued moving through her days exactly as before. One Saturday morning, she visited a community center in Philadelphia. The building buzzed with activity. Students practiced presentations. Parents attended workshops. Volunteers organized educational materials. As Simone walked through the center, dozens of people greeted her warmly. A teenage girl stopped her near the entrance. "You probably do not remember me," she said nervously. Simone smiled. "Try me." The young woman laughed softly. 3 years ago, you spoke at my middle school. You told us not to let other people decide how big our dreams could be." Her eyes brightened. "Next month I start college." Simone's expression softened. "Congratulations." The young woman shook her head. "No, thank you." For a moment neither spoke. Around them, conversations continued. Children laughed. Doors opened and closed. Sunlight streamed through high windows. It was an ordinary moment. Yet somehow it carried more meaning than any headline. Later that evening, Nathaniel sat beside Simone during dinner. The city lights shimmered beyond the glass walls of the penthouse. The atmosphere felt calmer than it had in years. "You have been busy lately," he said. Simone smiled slightly. "So have you." Nathaniel looked down at his plate before speaking again. "I read the latest article." Simone paused. "And?" He took a slow breath. "I did not know about most of it." The honesty surprised even him. Simone studied his face for a moment. There was no defensiveness in his voice. No arrogance. Only quiet reflection. "There was never much reason to talk about it," she replied gently. Nathaniel nodded. Yet deep down he knew that was not entirely true. The reason had never been a lack of opportunity. The reason was that he had not asked. Outside, the lights of New York stretched endlessly beneath the night sky. Inside, the distance between two people who had spent years living parallel lives seemed slightly smaller than before. And as the date of the ceremony drew closer, neither of them realized just how dramatically the next few weeks would change everything. The invitation arrived with less than 10 days remaining before the ceremony. Thick ivory paper rested inside a navy envelope embossed with silver lettering. It sat on the kitchen counter beside a stack of student reports and unopened mail until Simone finally picked it up late one evening. Outside, Manhattan glowed beneath a clear autumn sky. The city seemed unusually calm. Traffic moved in distant streams of light far below the penthouse windows. Simone opened the envelope and carefully reviewed the final event details. The ceremony would take place at the Grand Meridian Ballroom, one of the most prestigious venues in New York. National leaders, university presidents, philanthropists, educators, and business executives would attend. The program included a tribute video, a formal presentation, and a keynote address from the award recipient herself. Simone read the information quietly before setting it aside. For a moment, she simply stared at the skyline. None of this felt real. She had spent years working in classrooms, community centers, libraries, and school auditoriums. She had become comfortable in places where folding chairs mattered more than chandeliers. Yet now she was being invited onto one of the largest public stages of her life. Across the room, Nathaniel looked up from his tablet. "Is that the final schedule?" he asked. Simone nodded. "Looks like it." Nathaniel set the tablet down. "I assume I should clear my calendar." Simone looked surprised. "You do not have to." He studied her for a moment. "I know." The answer lingered in the air between them. Simple, direct, different from the man she had known for years. The next morning, preparations began moving quickly. Event coordinators called. Foundation representatives confirmed logistics. Journalists requested interviews. Simone declined most media appearances. She wanted the focus to remain on education, not celebrity. The foundation respected her wishes, though they gently reminded her that public attention could help expand future opportunities for students. Meanwhile, Claire Bennett continued following developments from the newsroom. Her first article had generated extraordinary engagement. Readers connected with Simone's story in ways few expected. As a result, national networks began preparing coverage of the upcoming ceremony. Claire reviewed interview footage, scholarship records, and photographs collected from former students. The deeper she explored, the more powerful the story became. One afternoon, she received access to archival videos submitted by communities across the country. The recordings showed students opening acceptance letters, families celebrating scholarships, children entering renovated libraries for the first time, teachers crying during dedication ceremonies. None of the clips focused on Simone herself. Instead, they focused on outcomes: hope, opportunity, transformation. Claire realized that the upcoming tribute video might become one of the most emotional presentations the foundation had ever produced. Days passed quickly. Everywhere Nathaniel went, conversations eventually turned towards Simone. Investors mentioned her. Journalists asked about her. Community leaders praised her. What surprised him most was not the admiration. It was the consistency. The praise came from completely different people in completely different industries, yet they all described the same qualities: integrity, humility, service, impact. One evening, Nathaniel attended a private dinner hosted by a major university. Candlelight reflected across polished tables while guests discussed education and leadership. During dessert, the university president raised a glass. "Before we conclude," he said, "I would like to recognize someone whose work has inspired institutions across the country." Several guests immediately mentioned Simone's name. The president smiled. "Exactly." Laughter drifted through the room. Nathaniel smiled politely, but inside he felt something shifting again. Years ago, he had believed influence came from commanding attention. Now he was witnessing something entirely different. Simone rarely sought attention at all, yet people respected her in a way that felt deeper than admiration. They trusted her. That realization stayed with him during the drive home. When he arrived at the penthouse, he found Simone sitting near the windows reviewing her speech notes. A yellow lamp cast a warm glow across the pages. The city lights sparkled behind her like distant stars. Nathaniel paused before speaking. "Are you nervous?" Simone laughed softly. "A little. You have spoken in front of thousands of people. Not like this." She glanced down at the notes. "This feels different." Nathaniel walked closer and looked out across the skyline. For several moments, neither spoke. The silence felt comfortable. Then Simone asked a question. "Why are you coming?" Nathaniel turned toward her. The answer arrived more quickly than he expected. "Because I want to be there." Simone held his gaze for a second longer than usual. Then she nodded quietly and returned to her notes. Outside, the city continued shining beneath the night sky. Inside, the distance that had separated two lives for years seemed to shrink with every passing day. And somewhere beyond the lights of Manhattan, preparations were already underway for a night that would leave an entire ballroom on its feet. The night of the ceremony arrived beneath a sky so clear it seemed every light in Manhattan had been polished for the occasion. The Grand Meridian Ballroom glowed like a jewel in the center of the city. Rows of black cars lined the entrance. Photographers stood behind velvet ropes. Television crews adjusted cameras beneath towering chandeliers visible through the glass facade. Inside, hundreds of guests filled the ballroom. University presidents exchanged greetings with philanthropists. Governors spoke with nonprofit leaders. Educators from across the country gathered around elegantly set tables covered in white linen and silver candlelight. Soft music drifted through the room while enormous screens displayed photographs celebrating years of educational achievement. The atmosphere felt important, but not because of wealth or status. Tonight was about impact. Tonight was about lives changed. Simone stood quietly in a private reception area behind the ballroom. Her hands rested lightly on a folder containing the speech she had revised several times over the past week. Through a nearby doorway, she could hear the distant hum of conversation and the occasional burst of laughter from guests arriving inside. She took a slow breath. The nervousness was still there, but it no longer felt overwhelming. It felt meaningful. A foundation representative approached with a warm smile. "Ready?" Simone looked toward the ballroom entrance and nodded. "I think so." Across the building, Nathaniel entered through the main reception hall. The moment he stepped inside, he realized this event was different from anything he had expected. He recognized faces from business magazines, government panels, and national television. Yet none of them seemed interested in discussing markets or investments. Everywhere he looked, people were talking about education, programs, students, communities, opportunities. Several guests recognized him immediately and approached to shake his hand. The conversations always followed a similar pattern. They congratulated him. They praised Simone. They shared stories connected to her work. One retired university chancellor described scholarship recipients who had graduated with honors. Another guest spoke about a community center transformed through educational funding. A former governor called Simone one of the most influential civic leaders in the country. Nathaniel thanked each person politely, but inside he felt increasingly humbled. The scale of her impact seemed to grow with every conversation. Eventually, he found his assigned seat near the front of the ballroom. Crystal chandeliers reflected thousands of points of light across the ceiling. Elegant centerpieces shimmered beneath soft golden illumination. A massive stage stood at the far end of the room, framed by towering screens. Nathaniel glanced around. Every seat appeared occupied. Hundreds of people had gathered here. Not because of celebrity, not because of entertainment. They had come because they genuinely respected what Simone represented. The realization settled quietly in his chest. Moments later, the lights dimmed. Conversations softened. A spotlight illuminated the stage as the evening's host stepped forward. The ballroom gradually fell silent. The host welcomed everyone and spoke about the power of education to transform generations. Awards were presented. Several honorees received recognition for their contributions. Applause filled the room repeatedly. Yet Nathaniel noticed something interesting. As the evening progressed, anticipation seemed to build. Guests checked the program. Conversations during breaks returned to one name again and again: Simone Carter. Even before her presentation began, people seemed eager for the moment. Backstage, Simone listened carefully as the program moved forward. The sounds of applause drifted through the curtains. Event coordinators moved calmly around her. A television monitor displayed the ballroom. She could see rows of guests seated beneath warm lights. She could see Nathaniel among them. For a brief moment, their eyes met through the monitor feed. Nathaniel offered a small nod. It was simple, quiet, genuine. Simone smiled softly. Then she turned her attention back to the stage. The final award category approached. The ballroom grew increasingly still. The host returned to center stage and opened a small envelope. The spotlight brightened. The room seemed to hold its breath. Nathaniel sat forward slightly in his chair. Around him, hundreds of guests fixed their attention on the stage. The host began speaking about service, leadership, and the belief that opportunity should never depend on zip codes or family income. Images of students appeared across the giant screens. Libraries, classrooms, graduation ceremonies, hope. Then the host paused. The silence felt electric. "Tonight," she said, "we honor a woman whose work has changed thousands of lives across America." And for the first time that evening, the entire ballroom erupted into applause before her name had even been announced. The applause continued rolling through the ballroom like a wave moving across an ocean of people. Nathaniel looked around and realized the reaction was unlike anything he had witnessed at business conferences, charity galas, or corporate celebrations. This applause was not polite. It was not ceremonial. It was personal. People were clapping because they cared. The host smiled and waited for the room to settle before speaking again. Behind her, photographs appeared across the enormous screens. Images from classrooms, community centers, libraries, graduation ceremonies, children holding books, students receiving scholarships, families celebrating milestones they once believed impossible. The room grew quiet as the host continued. For more than a decade, this year's honoree has dedicated her life to expanding educational opportunity across America. Her programs have supported thousands of students, strengthened communities, and created pathways toward futures that once seemed out of reach. Nathaniel felt his chest tighten. The images continued changing behind the host. Some were familiar, many were not. He watched photographs of projects Simone had never discussed, entire initiatives he had never known existed, partnerships spanning multiple states, buildings renovated, technology programs launched, mentorship networks established. The scale of it all felt overwhelming. Around him, guests nodded with recognition. They knew these stories. They knew these accomplishments. Somehow everyone else seemed to understand the magnitude of Simone's work before he did. The host paused and smiled toward the audience. "Please direct your attention to the screen." The ballroom lights dimmed further. A soft piano melody filled the room. The first frame appeared. It showed a small public library standing on a quiet street beneath a bright summer sky. Then a young woman's voice began speaking. Before Dr. Carter's program came to our town, I had never met anyone who believed I could become an engineer. Another image appeared. A college campus. A student walking beneath autumn trees. Her scholarship changed my life. Then another voice. She taught us that our circumstances were not our destiny. More faces appeared. More stories. A teacher in Ohio. A physician in Texas. A school principal in Michigan. A software developer in California. Each person described a moment when Simone's support had changed the direction of their future. Some smiled while speaking. Others struggled to contain emotion. Yet every story carried the same message. Someone believed in them when they needed it most. Nathaniel sat completely still. The ballroom had become silent except for the voices from the screen. The tribute continued. Former students described receiving acceptance letters. Parents spoke about opportunities their children never would have had otherwise. Teachers shared stories about classrooms transformed by resources and support. One elderly principal wiped away tears while recalling a struggling school that eventually became one of the highest-performing campuses in its district. Then came a moment that seemed to stop the entire room. A young woman appeared on the screen wearing a white medical coat. Behind her stood the entrance to a children's hospital. "When I was 14, she said softly, my mother worked 2 jobs and still could not afford basic necessities. College felt impossible. Dr. Carter changed that. Today, I am a pediatrician. Every child I help carries a piece of her legacy." The ballroom remained completely silent. Nathaniel looked around. Several guests had lowered their eyes. Others sat motionless. Even seasoned leaders who spent careers making difficult decisions appeared deeply moved. The video shifted again. This time hundreds of photographs filled the screens in rapid succession. Smiling graduates, scholarship ceremonies, community events, school openings, mentorship programs, faces from every background and every corner of the country. Thousands of lives connected by one woman who never sought recognition. Then the final image appeared. Simone standing among a group of students. No spotlight, no stage, no award, just a simple photograph taken years earlier. The narrator's voice returned one last time. True leadership is not measured by how many people know your name. It is measured by how many lives are better because you existed. The screen faded to black. For a moment, nothing happened. The room seemed suspended in complete stillness. Nathaniel could hear only the faint sound of breathing around him. Then someone near the front began clapping. Another person joined. Then another. Within seconds, applause spread across the ballroom again, louder than before. Nathaniel felt something shift inside him as he stared at the dark screen. He had spent years building an empire people admired. Simone had spent those same years building futures people lived. And for the first time, he fully understood the difference. The applause continued growing until it filled every corner of the Grand Meridian Ballroom. What began as a few people clapping had become something far more powerful. Guests were no longer simply applauding a recipient. They were honoring a legacy. The sound rolled beneath the chandeliers and echoed across the enormous room like a wave that refused to fade. On stage, the host waited patiently, smiling as she looked toward the audience. Then, slowly, people began rising from their seats. A university president stood first near the front. Beside him, a governor followed. At another table, educators rose together. Across the ballroom, executives, philanthropists, teachers, nonprofit leaders, and former scholarship recipients stood one after another. Within moments, nearly the entire room was on its feet. Nathaniel remained seated for a second longer than everyone around him. Not because he did not want to stand, because he was overwhelmed by what he had just witnessed. The images from the tribute video still played through his mind. Thousands of lives, thousands of opportunities, thousands of futures, all connected to one woman he thought he already knew. Around him, people continued applauding. Some smiled through tears. Others nodded quietly, as if acknowledging something deeply meaningful. Nathaniel looked toward the stage and finally rose to his feet. As he stood, he felt a strange heaviness settle in his chest. Not shame alone, not regret alone, something more complicated. The realization that for years he had measured Simone against standards that suddenly seemed small. The host returned to the microphone. The applause continued. "Ladies and gentlemen, she said softly, waiting for the room to quiet. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Simone Carter. The standing ovation intensified. A spotlight illuminated the side entrance of the stage. Simone appeared from behind the curtain and stepped into the light. For a brief moment, she looked almost surprised by the reaction. The applause surrounded her from every direction. Hundreds of people remained standing. Hundreds of faces turned toward her with admiration and gratitude. Yet Simone did not react like someone enjoying attention. She simply paused. Her eyes moved slowly across the room. She seemed to take in the sight of the students seated near the front. The teachers, the volunteers, the families, the people whose journeys had become intertwined with her own. Nathaniel watched as she walked across the stage. Her posture remained calm. Her expression remained composed. She carried herself with the same quiet dignity she displayed in classrooms, community centers, and school auditoriums. The setting had changed. The woman had not. The applause lasted nearly a full minute before finally beginning to soften. Even then, many guests continued clapping. Simone reached the podium and looked out across the ballroom. The room gradually settled into silence. Nathaniel could hear only the faint sound of air moving through the vast hall. Every eye remained fixed on her. Every light seemed focused on her. Yet she did not appear intimidated. She appeared present, fully present. The foundation chairperson stepped forward and presented the award. It was a simple crystal sculpture reflecting the stage lights in brilliant patterns. Simone accepted it with both hands. More applause followed. Then the chairperson leaned toward the microphone. Dr. Carter, he said warmly, on behalf of everyone here tonight, thank you. The simplicity of the statement seemed to affect the audience more than any elaborate speech could have. Another round of applause filled the room. Nathaniel glanced around again. He noticed people exchanging knowing smiles. Former students wiping away tears. Teachers holding hands. Community leaders nodding quietly. This was not admiration built through publicity. This was gratitude earned over years of service. For the first time in a very long time, Nathaniel felt completely insignificant in the best possible way. His accomplishments suddenly seemed measured in transactions. Simone's accomplishments were measured in people. The difference was impossible to ignore. On stage, Simone placed the award carefully beside the podium. She adjusted a page of notes and looked out across the audience once more. The ballroom fell silent again. Even the photographers seemed reluctant to interrupt the moment. The air felt charged with anticipation. Everyone knew the standing ovation had already become one of the most memorable moments in the Foundation's history. Yet something told them the most important part of the evening had not happened yet. Simone took a slow breath. Her eyes reflected the light from hundreds of chandeliers overhead. Then she smiled softly and prepared to speak. For several seconds, Simone simply stood behind the podium and looked across the ballroom. The silence felt almost sacred. Hundreds of people waited for her first words. Crystal chandeliers cast warm reflections across the room. The award rested beside her, catching fragments of light. Somewhere near the back, a camera shutter clicked softly. Otherwise, there was only stillness. Simone smiled gently and adjusted the microphone. Thank you, she said. Her voice was calm, steady, and unmistakably sincere. The audience listened closely. I have spent most of my life in classrooms, community centers, libraries, and school cafeterias. So standing here tonight feels a little unusual. Soft laughter rippled through the room. The tension eased. Simone glanced briefly toward the audience. The truth is, I never imagined receiving an award like this. Not because I lacked ambition, but because I always believed the real success belonged to the students. Several heads nodded throughout the ballroom. She continued. Every opportunity one helped create started with a simple belief. That talent exists everywhere. Opportunity does not. The room grew quiet again. Nathaniel sat motionless in his seat. Every word seemed to land with remarkable clarity. There was no performance in her voice. No attempt to impress anyone. She was simply speaking from the place that had guided her entire life. Simone shared stories about students she had met. Nathaniel noticed something extraordinary. The audience was completely captivated. Business leaders who normally checked their phones during speeches remained focused. Political figures listened without distraction. University presidents leaned forward in their seats. Nobody wanted to miss a single word. Simone paused briefly before continuing. Many years ago, someone gave me a chance when they did not have to. Someone looked at a young woman with big dreams and limited resources and decided those dreams mattered. Her eyes reflected the warm stage lights. That act of kindness changed my life. Everything I have done since then has been an attempt to pass that opportunity forward. A hush settled over the ballroom. Nathaniel felt a lump rise unexpectedly in his throat. He realized that while Simone was discussing scholarships and educational programs, she was really talking about something larger. Human dignity. The belief that every person deserves to be seen, deserves to be valued, deserves a chance. The simplicity of the message made it even more powerful. As Simone continued speaking, images from the tribute video seemed to return in Nathaniel's mind. The physician, the teacher, the engineer, the students, the families, thousands of people whose lives carried traces of her influence. Yet she spoke as if their achievements belonged entirely to them. Never once did she claim credit. Never once did she seek praise. Near the front row, several former scholarship recipients wiped away tears. One teacher clasped her hands together beneath her chin. A university president removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes quietly. The emotional impact moved through the room not because Simone was dramatic, but because she was honest. Then came the moment nobody expected. Simone looked out across the audience and smiled softly. Tonight, people have been very kind in celebrating my work. But I hope everyone here remembers something important. The ballroom became completely silent. Buildings matter. Programs matter. Scholarships matter. But the greatest investment we can ever make is believing in another human being before they believe in themselves. The words seemed to settle over the audience like light. No one moved. No one spoke. Nathaniel felt something inside him shift again. He thought about all the times he had worried about appearances, about reputation, about how others perceived success. Meanwhile, the woman standing on that stage had spent years focused on something infinitely more meaningful. She had spent years believing in people. Simone looked down briefly at her notes before closing the folder completely. The audience noticed immediately. The remainder of her speech would come from memory, from the heart. And as she lifted her eyes toward the crowd once more, an unmistakable feeling spread through the ballroom. Everyone understood they were witnessing a moment they would remember for the rest of their lives. Simone stepped away from her notes and rested both hands lightly on the sides of the podium. The ballroom remained completely still. Hundreds of people watched her beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers. Beyond the stage, the city shimmered through towering windows, its lights stretching across the night like scattered stars. For a moment, she simply looked at the audience. Then she smiled. "Before I finish tonight, there is one more thing I would like to say." Her voice was calm, warm, and unmistakably sincere. Many people assume that recognition is the goal. It is not. The room remained silent. The goal is the student who discovers a future they never thought possible. The goal is the parent who no longer has to choose between paying a bill and buying school supplies. The goal is the teacher who finally has the resources to help every child in the classroom. Several guests nodded quietly. Simone glanced toward the former scholarship recipients seated near the front. If this evening means anything, I hope it reminds us that small acts of belief can create extraordinary outcomes. She paused. Someone believed in me. Then I believed in someone else. Then they believed in someone else. That is how change happens. The audience listened without moving. The simplicity of her words seemed to carry more weight than any prepared speech. When she finally thanked the foundation and stepped away from the microphone, the ballroom erupted once again. Applause thundered through the hall. Guests rose to their feet for a second time. The sound seemed even louder than before. Nathaniel stood with everyone else, clapping as he watched Simone accept congratulations from leaders, educators, and community advocates. Yet this time something was different. He no longer saw the evening through the lens of status or publicity. He saw it through the eyes of the countless people whose lives had been transformed by her work. As the ceremony concluded, guests formed long lines waiting to speak with Simone. Former students embraced mentors. Teachers shared stories. Community leaders introduced themselves. The atmosphere felt less like an awards gala and more like a reunion of lives connected by purpose. Nathaniel remained several steps back, observing quietly. For years he had occupied the center of nearly every room he entered. Tonight he was content to stand in the background. And for the first time, the background felt like exactly where he belonged. Eventually, the crowd began to thin. The ballroom slowly emptied. Staff members collected programs from tables. Candles flickered beneath the fading glow of the chandeliers. The noise of celebration softened into scattered conversations. Simone finally stepped away from the remaining guests and found Nathaniel waiting near the edge of the room. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence felt gentle rather than awkward. Nathaniel looked at her, then glanced around the ballroom. "I do not think I understood," he said quietly. Simone tilted her head slightly. "Understood what?" Nathaniel took a slow breath. "Any of it." The honesty in his voice surprised even him. There was no defense left. No excuse. Only truth. Simone studied him carefully. The lights reflected softly in her eyes. Nathaniel continued, "I spent years measuring success by the wrong things." He looked toward the stage where the award still rested beside a bouquet of flowers. "I thought influence was about being noticed." His voice lowered. "Tonight, I realized influence is about making other people stronger." Simone said nothing for a moment. She simply listened. Around them, the last few guests drifted toward the exits. The ballroom felt larger now, quieter. Nathaniel looked down briefly before meeting her eyes again. "I should have seen it sooner." Simone's expression softened. Not because she needed validation, not because she had been waiting for this moment, but because she recognized genuine humility when she heard it. "You see it now," she said. Nathaniel nodded slowly. The words settled between them. Outside, the lights of Manhattan continued shining beneath the clear night sky. Inside, years of distance seemed to dissolve beneath a simple truth. Simone had never needed the world to prove her worth. She had known her purpose long before the applause, long before the headlines, long before the standing ovation. The recognition had not changed who she was. It had only revealed who she had always been. As they walked toward the exit together, the ballroom behind them grew quiet. The stage lights dimmed one by one. The celebration was ending. But somewhere across the country, thousands of students would wake up the next morning with opportunities they would not have otherwise had. That was the real legacy. Not the award, not the applause, not the attention. And as Nathaniel stepped into the cool New York night beside the woman he finally understood, he realized the most important person in the room had never been hidden from the world. She had only been hidden from him.